Well, okay.
Oh,
Right.
well done,
Over
Peter.
to you.
Beautiful. Good. Lovely. Okay, so hi everyone, I'm Sione. A lot of you will know me, some of you might not. So I collected people together with Peter to create this book, which we hope you'll enjoy hearing about. So I'm not going to talk a lot about this first chapter because I think the themes that emerge throughout the following chapters will speak for themselves. And really my chapter was to provide an overview and to speak to the emergent themes that we saw coming through the book as each of our leaders wrote their chapters. So it's about psychologically informed environments and services, particularly from an organisational and leadership perspective. Next slide, please, Peter. I'm pressing it and thinking, why isn't there anything happening there? Yeah. Brilliant. So as you probably already know, but in case you don't, psychologically informed environments and trauma-informed approaches seek to understand why as humans working in health and social care services, we behave, think and feel the way we do within the context of the fundamental drivers for anything, change, and that's our relationships. So this is the kind of the nub and the essence of where Peter and I were really thinking about writing this book. Next slide, Peter, please.
One.
So this chapter was really an introduction to begin to think about how leaders and organisations affect the shape and journey of psychologically informed environments and trauma-informed approaches. And in particular, how both conscious and unconscious processes inform the experience of leaders and organisations. So how those processes both disable or enable our ability as organisations and leaders to begin to develop, implement and sustain these approaches. Next slide, Peter. So informing this invitation are two ideas, and this is the kind of framework that holds the book together. Next slide, Peter. The first, that relationships drive change for all of us. They are as central to successful and sustainable change in health and social care settings as they are in life to us. Next slide. And the second, using the key areas of PIE as guiding principles for leadership approach and organisational development can drive the use of psychologically informed approaches and thereby support the creation and delivery of these services. Next slide, please. And this enables leadership that is both relational and inclusive. And that's all I'm going to say, because the next chapters will speak for themselves. Peter,
that keeps us well within time. Well done. Fantastic. So yeah, the second chapter is by me. So we wrote the two introductory chapters really. And talking of introductions, Helen has done the introduction, but I moved her to after me and Sione. So we'll introduce the book and what we're talking about, but Helen will introduce PIE and the journey of PIE, because the rest of the book is about PIE really. So leadership in PIE and TIC. Trauma-informed care comes from a different background, and I think it's interesting to just know the backgrounds of these things. Trauma-informed care came out of the anti-psychiatry and survivors movement in America particularly, but then that was a global phenomenon, ended up with the Italians closing down all their asylums. And the idea was that people had been traumatized rather than that there was something wrong with them. And there was also a parallel process from Vietnam War veterans who lots of problems with Vietnam War veterans returning to these states, and these were down to trauma, I said. And it also came from a social justice background. the idea that a lot of the trauma was induced by inequality and by abuse and by oppression in societies, and that therefore what people needed to work with in social care and in mental health support was social justice and the impact of trauma. And then there was the ACE study in the late 90s. It was published by Felitti et al., which looked at the impact of adverse childhood events. And out of that, trauma-informed approaches were developed and have gradually evolved. And then there's loads and loads of different trauma-informed approaches, but there's a set of principles and things, which you can see in the book. Psychologically informed environments came actually out of therapeutic communities originally. And although I was looking at enabling environments and came across Winnicott, who was a psychoanalyst talking about facilitating environments way back in the early 50s, but therapeutic communities also started the main boom of therapeutic communities, if there was a boom, was in the 50s and 60s. And enabling environments came out of that. And enabling environments then through the administrations of Helen, really, and Robin, who was involved in enabling environments and is in the group here, Robin Johnson and Nick Maguire, and a part by me, was creation of psychologically informed environments directly as a response to the prevalence of trauma in homelessness and the amount of trauma that was recorded and documented as being impacting on people in their journey into homelessness. And the idea of the psychologically informed environments was to provide support to staff who were not clinically trained, but who were working with some of the most damaged people. And it was about the recognition of the role of trauma in people becoming dependent on drugs or becoming behaviors which society finds challenging, and the role of attachment, the role of relationships in working with people who have been marginalized and have been abused and traumatized. And I think that's the really big difference and the big bonus, I think, of psychologically informed environments, and why it provides an envelope for trauma-informed care is because of the emphasis on attachment and the importance of relationships. Trauma is not damaging per se, it's damaging in damaging relationships. As Anthony Bateman, who one of the creators of mentalization, said, adversity becomes traumatic when the mind experiences it alone. We need people around us. If we have a strong social network, then we overcome trauma because we didn't have resilience. And it's backed up. Karen Treisman, who is one of the big figures in trauma-informed care, says relational trauma requires relational repair. And Gabor Mate, who many of you will have heard of, big American psychologist, psychiatrist, safety is not the absence of threat, it is the presence of connection. Relationships matter. They're central to recovery. As The Boy Who Was Raised as a Dog book by Bruce Perry, which is an amazing book, says, as a result, recovery is also all about relationships, rebuilding trust, regaining confidence, returning to a sense of security, and reconnecting to love. Healing and recovery are impossible, even with the best medications and therapy in the world, without lasting, caring connections to others. And psychologically informed leadership, really, services need to be attachment informed as well as trauma informed. And psychologically informed leadership is to enable the attachment, is to manage relationships and to use relationships as part of the delivery of service, and to foster a relational sense within the organization so that it's reflective and thinks about the relationships within it. And I think when we think about leadership, we have to think differently about leadership in the health and care professions, because the purpose of leadership in a commercial company is to produce benefit for the shareholders. But the purpose of leadership in a company in the caring professions is to provide care and support for the beneficiaries. And that's really different. And that's why it requires a different form of leadership. It requires psychologically informed leadership to foster and sustain relationships outside and inside the organization, and to model reflective practice within the organization, and to enable and empower staff and the service users. A very different focus, as well as keeping the focus on the primary task, which is the recovery of the beneficiaries. So, whoops, I've gone too far, but I don't know how to go back. So that's stop. I don't know. I don't know how to go back. Sorry. I can stop sharing. I'll just stop sharing and start sharing again and just rearrange those slides. But I will hand over in the meantime to Helen, who will do the actual introduction to the book.
Thank you, Peter. So I'm Helen Peets. I worked with the Rough Sleepers unit originally back in 2002 with the wonderful Louise Casey, and stayed with DCLG in its various iterations right up until 2013, when the coalition decided that homelessness had been sorted and disbanded my team. We started out tackling rough sleeping, looking at the quick wins, and that was quite easy to do in the sense that reconnections, getting people back to where they had been, dealing with evictions, maybe changing the way that people could access hostels worked. But what we realised was that the issues around people with chronic homelessness, the ones who circled round between prison, squat, hostel, rough sleeping, sofa surfing, those were not being addressed by the way services were being offered. So I went to a seminar in Southampton in 2009, met Nick Maguire, who was then working at Southampton University as a psychologist, a lecturer, and we decided that his ideas around cognitive behavioural therapy and my ideas around how we could work differently with people who were chronically homeless could actually merge together. And it was very much based on the work that Robin Johnson, who's already been name checked, and I can't remember the name of the guy you worked with, Robin, but doing around work in prisons. They were called PIPEs then, psychologically informed planned environments. The acronyms are just appalling. However, PIEs became a concept in which we began to recognise that you had to work differently and you had to give a different offer to people for whom previous experiences hadn't worked out. Because the one thing you have to stop doing is, if it doesn't work, stop doing it. And we kept on as services doing the same thing over and over again and then blaming the person when it didn't work. So we wrote the guidance in 2010, we revised it with Peter, revised it and added to it in 2012. And this led to a number of organisations adopting the principles. Now, I think it's fair to say Louise Casey was sceptical. She's very much a practical person, and this seemed a bit airy-fairy to her. But it was when organisations like St Basil's, like London Borough of Lambeth, like St Mungo's, enthusiastically took on these principles that she said, I actually think this has got some traction. And the fact that we're still talking about it now in 2025 is really encouraging. And I think it's led on to the adoption of schemes such as Housing First. In other words, you don't have to work in the ways that you've always worked before. It is possible to do something different because you approach the problem differently. And as Peter says, it's about the relationships. I think it's fair to say that really good staff, and there are a lot of good staff working in homelessness, because this is what we originally started with, work instinctively to those principles. But what the PIE guidance tried to do was to embed that within a culture of an organisation. And I found, going to talk to a number of organisations and actually having been on the board of a few of them, that the board and senior management kind of think that's something frontline staff do. You just do it as an add-on, and it's not. It has to be part of the whole ethos and culture of the organisation, has to be embedded within it for it to work, because it's actually about recognising there are things impacting on people's lives, your clients' lives, that will affect how they work with the solutions that you offer them. One of the things I most remember about doing a rough sleep account in central London, in Westminster, the piazza in front of the cathedral, and there was a young lad, and he was sleeping next to the shop that sells all the religious memorabilia. And I said, why are you here? We got you an offer of a place. He was only about 19. And he said, I don't feel safe. He said, because if something has happened, I haven't got anywhere to run. Now, if your childhood experience has been you're being unsafe under a roof in a room, offering someone over and over again the option of somewhere to live in a room is not going to make you feel safe. So you aren't going to do it. So you have to unpick what it is the problem is and how can you then overcome that. So there were a number of really good examples that we actually came up with. I think the two abiding principles that I've used, and I know fellow enthusiasts of PIE have used, is, as I've said, if something doesn't work, stop doing it. Do something different. If you offer somebody a property and they won't sleep in the bed and they sleep on the floor, that's fine. If it takes 6 months for them to have the courage to sleep in the bed, another 6 months to get the pajamas on and get into the bed, that's because they're beginning to feel safe. But you can't second guess what people are going to do. And the other really, really big thing is the person is not the problem is the problem. And we found that we were looking as a group of people, whenever you mentioned their names to service providers, they'd go, because they become linked to the problem, and they're not. They're dealing with the problem as best they can. They're survivors. And we need to make sure that the services we offer them recognise that, and that it starts from the top down. So I'm enormously pleased this book's been written. I'm really thrilled that it's covered so many different areas. And the fact that it's really talking about how it has to be embedded in an organisation is music to my ears. And I'm very grateful to have been asked to write the foreword. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Helen. Right, I will now attempt to share at the appropriate place. And here we go. Yeah, that looks possible from current slide. Yep. Okay. Go in.
So hi, thank you, Peter, Sione, for the invite to write the chapter and then to speak. And yeah, it's been a real sort of pleasure to read all the different chapters and to see the themes that are picked out. And as Helen's just said, you know, the themes that just are recurring all the way through about that idea of being really human in our workplace, really. And that's what I'm sort of trying to get to with my slides. So first slide, please, Peter. So I work for St Martin's and I'm the registered manager of a registered care home for people with a dual diagnosis, severe mental illness, problematic substance use. And the phrase has stands around more than anything else about being, you know, everyone's got to be person-centred all the time. Everyone wants to be sort of person-centred, and you have this idea of all these different agencies that are all vying for being the most person-centred agencies, and we can sort of lose the sort of connection to the human in the middle. And that's always been something that, for me, especially with such heavy legislative oversight as a registered care home, I see again and again. So when I was introduced into the PIE framework, could I have the next slide, please, Peter? I've really felt that we drove the idea of starting with the systems and starting with the language that sort of holds that person in that sort of central space, and sort of flipped it around. So that frontline worker, the person-facing worker, we sort of freed up the idea of building those relationships. You know, it's just absolutely overwhelmed when I first heard, you know, the idea of trauma-informed support and psychologically informed support, that there's these systems that could actually emphasize that human quality before anything else. And I think that it's you know, the idea of successfully shifting the language into that human first and placing the emotions of the individuals we look after and support in the centre is a really great thing. As I moved into management and into moving into senior leadership, I sit on the SMT of the organisation. It really made me realise how, as has been touched on already, that sometimes it's the frontline worker who's just expected to be able to do this. This idea that you've got these connections that are being formed and are maybe then left there. And it's something that has really sort of spurred me on to push the sort of psychological informed model up through St Martin's as an organisation, because I really feel strongly that, could I have the next slide, please, Peter? Really, really strongly that to create stability within that social space, to provide the support network that of the great work that everyone's doing day to day, front facing, you need a structure that is absolutely resilient to those pressures, the pressures of that day-to-day experience of attachment, of rupture, repair, of that problematic substance use, of seeing people, that level of human distress. So yeah, I really want to focus my chapter and focus my few minutes on that idea of the manager embodying the service, of leading as you would hope everyone else will behave, of always framing things through that human dynamic, of being that stabilizing force and not allowing the systems that we're all beholden to overwhelm and to become the primary focus of that manager. And the other thing is, as someone who's in that sort of middle management space, is for me is to see it as being a real sort of luxury. We have the capacity to manage up and down, to share those voices up into the CEOs and the trustees, but also have the pleasure of working day to day within those actual real human dynamics. Final slide, please, Peter. Yeah, finally, we were inspected a while ago now, but we'll be embedding the psychologically informed framework. And just to say to any managers out there that think, oh, well, you know, can we do this? Is it possible? What's the purpose? Is that not only does it support the frontline worker, the manager, and the people that need our care and support, but it can be used to frame the systems that we have and for it to show excellence. You know, we were lucky enough to be inspected by an inspector who really saw what we were doing and sort of saw the PIE framework as a really successful evaluation tool. So yeah, we're really pleased. I was ever so glad I was introduced to it, and yeah, very pleased to be part of a community of like-minded people. That's me done.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, Sione. And the next, I'm sorry, we're kind of zooming through this, but we have got a tight schedule here. So next is Amanda and Jean. And I will move on to the next slide, which I trust will be one of theirs.
It will be, Peter. Yeah.
Yay, look at that.
Well, thank you. Thank you very much, Peter. I'm Jean Templeton, Chief Executive at Basils, and this is Dr. Amanda Skeet, our PIE lead. And again, we were really pleased to be invited. Never written a chapter before, so yeah, that was exciting. So next slide, please, Peter. We're gonna share this, so hopefully not too much jumping around. Just a little bit about us. St Basil's has been going since really the late 60s and works with young people that are aged 16 to 25 who are homeless, at risk of homelessness. And it was great to hear Helen, because a lot of our involvement really in terms of PIE was back in that 2010, 11, 12, when there was that kind of review. And Nick Maguire, we were involved with Nick. And I'll have to be honest, in the early days, I was a wee bit cynical about it, because we had been so used to health services telling us all the things that Helen just described. It's adolescence, it's about their behavioral change, or it's personality disorder, or it's always the young person's fault. It's never the system. It was never the system issues. So when this research was carried out and it was first looked at, we were a bit kind of, oh, is this just another way of pathologizing young people and not actually tackling a lot of the real issues behind homelessness? Anyway, it was like light bulb moment, because it wasn't about that. And that's why we kind of took a whole organization approach and have still done it all those years on. And in effect, this is what we're about. We want young people to feel cared about, to have trusted support, i.e. we have to be trustworthy for that, because we can all see through it when it's not. And we want that place for them to be, just as Helen described, that it's safe, it's suitable, it's affordable. But it isn't just trapping them. It actually enables them to do all the things that they might want to do, use their talent, their skills, etc., to move forward. Next slide, please, Peter. And the kind of framework that we used really to take that whole organizational approach was, it comes from social pedagogy really, and a lot of you will probably sort of recognize it. We simplify it in terms of the head, the heart, the hands, and it can be used at organizational level, can be used at team level, it can be used at individual level, in relation to the points that you made, Sione and Peter, as well, about the relational bit. Yes, you can have the thinking skills, you need the strategic piece, you have to understand that bigger picture, but you also need the heart element. You need the relational stuff, the emotional understanding. And if you haven't got the operational piece and the skills to do the job, then, you know, there's always something missing. So in terms of everything that we do and kind of weave PIE through everything we do, we talk about strategic doing. We use this kind of framework to have that implementation weave. I'm going to pass over to Amanda now and for the next slide, please, Peter.
Thank you. So this is a sample of our PIE tools and our psychological framework, which is again one of the key aspects of PIE. And more when we're doing the sort of training, we're emphasising, particularly to those who have sort of management and leadership roles, to get them to sort of reflect on how do they apply it when managing their team, managing their colleagues. So our PIE skills pyramid, you can see very much is sort of around that person-centered approach, listening and validating the other people. And when we're sort of talking about this with our managers, with our senior leaders, we ask them questions like, have you listened and validated your work, your colleague, the people that you're managing? So it's sort of really pushing, because we know often managers get promoted because they're excellent and they work sort of intuitively with clients. But it's challenging them to then apply those skills that they learn to working as a frontline worker to much more thinking about teams and management and leadership. So again, you know, we've got, you can see our traffic light system there for maintaining compassion. And we ask our managers, can you maintain compassion when perhaps somebody's work performance isn't very good? Perhaps they're not being psychologically informed in the way that they are working with our young people. And it's taking these sort of tools that helps us think about how can we apply PIE to all people, not just saying this is something you do to clients. Next slide, please. And part of that is being able to actually hear, listen, validate, and explore with our colleagues about how hard the role is. That we know we're asking sort of our frontline staff to work in extremely challenging environments, such as sort of COVID, cost of living crisis, this constant do more for less. And actually hear and work with them and collaborate with them on how do we help them and what can we put in place with them in order to make a psychologically informed culture that feels psychologically informed for the workforce, not just for the young people that we want to support and offer services to. Next slide, please, Peter. And part of that is to make sure our leaders, our managers at all levels have a space, have that reflective practice space to think about how do they use the skills that they learn, how do they use the psychological evidence to establish behaviours within their teams that fit with our psychological framework. And we found that it's really important. So initially when we started doing reflective practice, we had managers with their teams, but found that actually managers needed that space, that headspace, that reflective thinking to think about how do we motivate our workforce at times? How do we deal with things we've just been through a restructure in a psychologically informed way? What does that look like?
I think, yeah, the less technical things. So the way I describe it is you can't boss people into being psychologically informed. And I think it was said at the beginning, really, it has to be all the way through the organization. You know, people have to see and feel, you know, that they are being listened to, seen, valued and heard and know that they have been. And so when organizations come to us and say, I'd like to do a bit of PIE training for this team or that team, we're kind of a wee bit reluctant because in our view, it has to be all the way through. It has to be the senior leadership team. We do PIE foundation training for our board members as well. Reflective practice all the way through. It has to be your business support, your HR, your property services, as well as those that are working with young people. So, and I think through that, you know, over monitoring the impacts over the years, you know, it takes a long time for people to say they actually know they are operating within a PIE organization. So it's got to be that you've got to stick with it. You've got to be determined. It's got to be perpetual and intentional. And I think we have to shift this little drawing about the intention impact. It's the sort of, we've done a lot of work on this, because so often, particularly as individuals, but in systems as well, we defend the intention. You know, we're not racist, we're not this, we're not that. It's not our intention to be, but if you don't listen to what the experience was and what the impact is, then you just carrying on and doing what you've always done, because it's always somebody else's fault. That's us. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. That's fantastic stuff as ever from St. Basil. Wonderful, beautiful diagrams as well. Your graphics are fantastic. We're now moving to Jennifer.
Thank you, Peter and Sione. Thank you very much for the invitation to write a chapter. For anyone who's not been through the process of publishing, we as organisations, we as human beings, we're always constantly evolving. Of course, one of the fears I had was when I finally received my author's copy of the book was almost reading it through my fingers and thinking, oh my goodness, have I completely changed my view or my opinion since writing the original manuscript? I don't know if other authors were in that situation as well. My presentation just consists of the one slide. My day job is Director of Services working at Solace. We're the second largest provider of violence against women and girls services within the UK. And most of our service provision is in London. So next slide. Thank you. I was very conscious, chapter number 5, of a lot of what I said would been said before by other colleagues. So I was just thinking about just really setting the scene of what might be slightly different. So at Solace, if you could, Peter, if you could just go through, just keep hitting return and we'll get all the points up and I'll just briefly talk to all of them. So our journey with PIE began in 2016 to 17. We were given some funding and we were asked to improve refuge access, particularly for cohorts of women who might struggle to find refuge space. We were given 6 months to set up a PIE. Which, as we all know, the work of a PIE, establishing it properly is lifelong work. So much of this really follows the flavour of what we do experience. Other colleagues present tonight will know of the challenge that there is with very short-term funding, but 6 months, even for the Vogue sector, which is hugely agile, is a real challenge. But I think one of the things which was one of the drivers for that success and for the continued success which we have is we are an organisation full of advocates, and Helen very eloquently spoke to sometimes the challenges we have, perhaps workers who may be stuck, that actually become part of those system blockers sometimes. But I think within particularly the work of understanding gender-based violence, the service providers who deliver that really do understand that very gender-based lens, as in why gender-based violence occurs, why it is very difficult for survivors to seek help and to sustain progress which they may make within those systems. So we're really pushing an open door in terms of that initial work. It was really well received, but also sustaining it as well. One of the things which is a little bit different to some of the other chapters is really the context in which our work happens. We generally will work with people with a much shorter time frame. We are predominantly commissioned to provide crisis response services of some, say, 12 weeks duration. And this is within the context of many of the survivors we work with will have been experiencing harm, repeated harm and trauma for around 9 years before they will actually be able to access support. So for us, the challenge is we're really acutely aware we've got a really short window. So there's real pressure we feel to get it right. How do we provide that PIE response within a really short period of time, which can often involve very short periods of contact within that as well? I'm really grateful to Peter, your explanation in earlier chapters about the interchangeability in which we have as organisations. You know, we've used elements of the PIE model and trauma-informed care. And obviously, it won't surprise you as an organisation like Solace, we've kind of moved from being PIE and using that very seamlessly. What was being asked for, what we were being commissioned for, the language we adopted was actually trauma-informed care. And it kind of happened without any of us really perhaps paying attention to that. So one of the things which I do talk about in the conclusion of my chapter is what language is actually helpful for us going forward. It's really understandable for people to understand the work in which we do in terms of working with the different forms of gender-based violence, that essentially what we are dealing with is a lot of trauma within the system, whether that's presented by obviously people we work with, but also those who also provide those services in terms of the often higher presentation of lived experience that there will be with service providers within such an environment. And so I've really reflected on really the focus of the word, the use of the word trauma as actually perhaps being something which might be quite unhelpful for a number of reasons within the conclusion to my chapter. And so I've come full circle. So much as I'm quite relieved I read my chapter and didn't find that I'd really thought any differently about our approach, our work, as an organisation, we've kind of come full circle where we seamlessly kind of blended into trauma-informed care. We've actually come right back round, and actually we've really actually thought PIE is the model and the way forward in terms of where we want to go. Thank you. That's all from me.
Thank you, Jennifer. That's lovely. Yeah, I love that circle. And it's really important, isn't it, to be inclusive as well and to keep in all these different things. But we do have to move on. I think we're probably running somewhat behind time at the moment. Sione looks worried. I'm not doing my job properly. The next is I think Jalil and Ivana are going to talk for CHT in their chapter.
Hello, I'm Jalil. I'm CEO of Community Housing Therapy, or CHT.
And I'm Ivana. I'm the Head of Learning and Development for CHT.
So we are two of four. Oh, go.
I was just going to ask Peter for slide 2.
Oh, yes. So we are 2 of 4 authors of our chapter. So how 4 people managed to write a chapter, I don't really know, but we did. But our chapter is a story of how CHT adopted the PIE framework back in 2017. So who or what is CHT? So CHT is a charity providing therapeutic communities for people living with some of the most complex and enduring mental health difficulties. In other words, this is about people who have often been excluded everywhere else and what happens when you change the environment around them. Our residents have always arrived with long histories of hospital admissions, fractured relationships, and complex trauma. What they hopefully find with us is not just housing, but a community, a place where, as we like to say, relationships are the treatment. Next slide, please, Peter.
Holding on to that ethos hasn't always been easy. By 2016, austerity and commissioning changes were hitting hard, and I'm sure quite a lot of you would remember that. Occupancy numbers were dropping. Commissioners wanted models that could explain to funding panels with clear outcomes and language of measurability. The truth was we needed to adapt or face closure. Next slide, please, Peter.
So in 2017, with a new CEO, we began the process of embedding PIE, psychologically informed environments, into our existing psychoanalytic therapeutic community model. But change is rarely neat. As one of our service managers put it, the early days of PIE implementation felt similar to playing as part of a rugby team, exciting, energizing, rewarding, but also a surprisingly bruising affair.
And that's exactly how it felt, and it has been painful at times. Staff who had been proud of the work suddenly found themselves asked to see it through a critical lens. It's a bit like one day you're doing your job and then the next you realize you've got it all wrong. Not quite that brutal, but close enough. At the same time, residents' voices were becoming stronger. The voice of the community was much quicker into flight or flight, much less fragmented. The power dynamics were shifting.
Next slide, please.
This is the next slide. Sorry, I pressed the button.
Yeah, Peter was too quick.
Yeah, no, that's fine. So, okay, and then there was the day the new CEO and myself, then the head of services, came to meet the residents. The staff were asked to leave their own living room and the room with the piano, the TV, the place where the community had painted together.
And the symbolism of that was stark and predictable. If you shut the staff out and the residents in with the CEO, the staff are going to get a pasting. And so it came to pass. But what mattered was what happened next, because no jobs were lost, no punishment handed down. A split had been manufactured, but still it was recognizably ours. There was room for repair and reparation.
And out of that rupture came something important. The recognition that we needed to listen differently to residents and to each other. Next slide, please, Peter.
Over time, the language of complaints, all we ever do is sit and talk, you never listen, became the starting point for dialogue rather than the end of it. Even the ordinary details of daily life became part of our therapeutic story. Missing teaspoons, paint splashed on the walls, a kicked-in bathroom door. These weren't just messes to be managed. They were clues to relationships, risk, and recovery.
Next slide, Peter.
Next slide.
What we discovered that our social spaces, with all their coffee stains and contradictions, were essential to healing as any therapy room.
And perhaps most importantly, we learned that change itself could be reparative. It hurt, it unsettled people, but it also deepened our practice.
Today, CHD is still what it's always aspired to be, a place where people with the most complex needs can live, recover, and grow.
But it's also something new. We believe it's more sustainable, more reflective, more able to hold change itself as a part of therapeutic process. It's about slowing down enough to notice the coffee stains on the table or the slammed door and asking what that tells us about someone's inner world.
And last slide, please, Stephen. Because in the end, relationships are the treatment.
And that applies not only to our residents, but to us all in organization. Thank you all. That's our chapter in a snapshot.
Thank you very much. That's great. And then one more before we move on to organizational development, there's one more on services, which is Natasha and Jeff. And just I'll mention the other author of that chapter was Rex Haig, who isn't with us for personal reasons, but was also one of the people who, with Robin Johnson, wrote the papers on enabling environments and was involved in that. So
that was it, Rex.
Yeah, Rex. So I will hand over to Jeff and Natasha. I hope. Jeff and Natasha, are you still there? Natasha, I can see you.
I think Jeff's talking, but he's on mute, Peter.
Oh, I can't see Jeff on my screen.
Hi, So I'm Jeff Dennis. Rex can't be with us tonight. He's otherwise engaged. But my colleague Natasha, say hi. Are you there, Natasha? You're on mute. Hello? Hello? I think Natasha's on mute.
Or the microphone's not working because it
Let
doesn't
me
say
find
mute
out.
on the screen.
She was working earlier.
Oh, look at Natasha.
She is here, Jeff.
I know
She
she's
is here,
here.
and it doesn't seem that it's muted on the screen. It's on my screen.
Are you there? Can you hear
But there's
me?
a problem with sound.
She's
Right.
waving at you.
She's waving, but she can't. Yeah, I'm afraid it may fall to you, Jeff, because
Okay. So I'll
we
carry
are
on.
running seriously behind now.
Just to give you context, it's about the NHS local authority and not-for-profit sector working in partnership across Slough. Slough's a population of 167,000 people, and we are the CMHT working with severe and enduring people, so quite complex client group with high comorbidity. This project we're talking about here is 15 years in the making. Can I have slide 1, please, Peter?
Can you hear me now?
Yay!
Hey.
Oh,
Welcome.
yes.
Right.
Sorry
I've
about
taken
that.
the liberty of introducing you, Natasha.
Thank you. Go for
I
it.
apologise for being presumptuous. Okay, so why we needed transformation and to move from disconnection to inclusion. We had a fragmented hierarchical mental health services. There's a clear disconnect between services and people experiences of services. So we set about reconstructing all of the CMHT front-facing services to go from recovery to discovery. And in that journey, it created a new identity for people. It created a purpose for people, and it created a bigger, wider community, not a silo, but across a town. That was the vision, that was the pathway. And in doing so, we reframed shared responsibility about health and who should be contributing to health. It was us, the provider, but also people joined up with that. We made health as a social movement. Now, some of the obstacles that we came across were distrust, systemic inertia, and a legacy of exclusion. Now, that is interchangeable from providers and service users, all joined up with that mistrust and that inertia.
And just to add to that, we began with voices on the margin and reframed health as a shared responsibility, rooted in connection and sense of purpose. Next slide, please, Peter. So here we go, relational practice. So we're placing relationships first and rewriting the rules. We like to call it, as Jess said, doing the dance differently. So we replaced consultation process with ongoing authentic co-production. We also introduced relationally enabling groups to flatten power structures and hierarchies. And we redesigned physical and psychological spaces so that we could enable that human connection throughout. So our services grew from trust and need and not top down. So the key kind of obstacles that we were coming across, it was very much a requirement of letting go of control for people and embracing that uncomfortable vulnerability, which wasn't easy for everyone.
And out of that, what came? Transformation starts when we stop performing authority and start building trust, where everyone has a seat round the table and everyone is encouraged to find a voice. And that's a very important change within NHS services, local authority, for that empowerment for people to find a voice. Next slide, please, Peter. The innovations with heart, programs born of people. The circle works, the first thing there is how we flattened the power dynamic and created an inclusive forum for people to contribute to service change. It started with 2 people.
Jeff, we're going to have to go through this a little bit quickly because we're really running out of time. So
we're the first ones to get rushed, Peter. I object. I will try and talk faster. Okay, Circle Works grew from 2 people to 50 people. And on one occasion, we had 500 people celebrating World Mental Health Day, collectively contributing to services. Co-production became the treatment. Community became the intervention. Recovery reframed as discovery, which allowed for a new identity and connection, and not just seeing people as a diagnosis. The philosophy we wrote in Slough co-produced names that quite clearly. We are more than a diagnosis. We are people. We supported transitions with all the peer mentors, helping hands. And as people become more empowered, the voices got louder and bigger and more inclusive, including working with our supportive living colleagues as a part of this whole design. The obstacles we came across were, it needed a lot of work to sustain partnerships, to revalue the roles, and to rebuild that trust in a therapeutic process.
And just to add, these were not just projects. They were actually invitations to people to belong, to contribute, and to kind of heal together. And the next slide, please. So we're talking about system synergy, one story, many voices, basically. So our Enabling Town Slough website was co-produced, that tied all the threads together. Then we like to say that our projects fed into one another like currents in a stream. Public health was heavily involved as well, and integration and supporting of county-wide projects embedded our model beyond its origin in Slough. Our evaluation included economic impact, lived experience narratives, important, and national recognition. And the kind of key obstacles were very much about how do we balance that creativity we had and co-production with accountability, whilst being in a very complex multi-sector system.
And what we learned from that, when the whole town becomes therapeutic, we stop delivering services and we start living services. So an absolute change, fundamental change. Next slide, please, Peter. So from all of the trauma-informed principles underpinned every interaction about choice, collaboration and empowerment, we use Joiner's theory of suicide as an operational pathway. We use the disconnect to connection, burden to collaboration and being a part of, and acquired capability to do self-harm to acquired capability to do good for self and others. Co-production, from our experience, is not a finish line, it's a mode of being embedded through the whole of the locality. Now, the community itself became therapeutic. Now, we use the Ubuntu philosophy of I am because we are because I am, embedded through the whole of the work we're actually doing. And the final insight there is we're not just building services, we are building one another. And that's kind of the statement that people actually make that are part of this movement, because it is a movement, health is a social movement that is paying great dividends for all.
And just to say final thought as well, Enabling Town Slough is much more than service change. It is a model that listens and learns and keeps moving forward. It's a process. So thank you all.
Thank you all. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, yeah, Peter.
Do read the chapter. It's a fantastic chapter, and it's a wonderful thing to imply in enabling environments and psychologically informed environments to a whole town, indeed a county. Okay, the second part of the book, which is actually part 3 of the book for some reason, is PIE and organizational development. So we've only got half an hour left, and my idea that we would have got through all the presentations and got to discussion by now is looking a bit ragged. However, this is also all this is really good stuff, and then there's so much good stuff in the book. That's the trouble. The next one is on reflective practice by Ali. So I'll hand over to Ali. I'll go to the next slide, which is hopefully Ali's. Yeah.
Thanks, Peter. And I might make up a little bit of time just by dint of the fact that I'm kind of maybe going into things that are a bit narrower. It's been amazing to listen to people talking about the psychological informed environment and the trauma informed care application in this systemic and the larger macro picture. And I am going to speak, I suppose, to my experiences of 6 years of developing a psychologically informed environment framework within the homeless sector in Ireland, and particularly developing out the reflective practice processes. And I was really pleased to hear so many people reference it from frontline to board. You know, I haven't gone into the challenges because, you know, I'm trying to stay on the positive, but I just wanted to touch on this. And I mean, most of the people I'm sure listening will have participated in their own reflective practice group, so this will not be news to you. But I guess I was thinking about it from the perspective of the reader who might be thinking, why would we adopt and invest, because it is an investment, in regular reflective practice supports for our teams. Next slide, please, Peter. So just by intro, my chapter really looks at trauma-informed care and PIE principles being by their very nature, therefore relational because they're client-centered. So of course it's speaking to that reciprocity piece. It's inherently in that. The relational nature of the work of caregiving with clients that have experienced trauma is part of that emotional labour, and therefore it cannot be in any way kind of legislated for within typical kind of HR or employment functions. And the reflective practice element of PIE obviously provides a safe and, most importantly, consistent space for processing the emotional response to the work, and therefore becomes, with the investment of time, a tool for development of relational capabilities. Next slide, please. So in terms of what my observation was working, you know, I would have worked across, and there's 42 groups running in the organisation that I would have set up this framework with, of which I probably worked with about, you know, 12 that were frontline. So what I observed as being really kind of, you know, important in terms of the relational development of the practitioner was that sharing and listening enables members to relate to each other's experiences, obviously through the peer learning piece. And you can see those little light bulbs going off, you know, but also the embodied responses as a kind of relational barometer, you know, feeling things that resonate and activate us, and also not necessarily having to speak to it. Just being in the circle, being in the room, feeling safe to have your own private experience and not feel like you're obliged to necessarily put language to it was very, you know, was very acute. You could really see the difference between practitioners and staff and frontline teams and management teams as they learned to be able to sit with what it was to be in that kind of relational reflective space, therefore improving the appreciation of the parallel process and the interjections of the client group experience, you know, often wondering, well, what's going on here? And I mean, I have a group analytic background, and so, you know, obviously over time I was bringing in that kind of, well, maybe we can consider what's happening in the group right now. You know, why are we so stuck? What's going on in the, you know, what's going on with your client group at the moment? Maybe there's some information there that can help us think about why we're stuck in the room right now. And the sense making together then in offering the relational reflection to group members, like building that trust, that empathy, that recognition that it's not a solution-focused conversation. It's not necessarily about solving an almost unsolvable problem, because as you've already outlined, my colleagues who have spoken previously, you know, this is an ongoing relationship with clients and participants and, you know, people who use the services that have a need that is not solved. It is about being available to it, and it's being about resilient and available to it. Next slide, please. Thanks. And so outside of the group, you know, looking with that capacity for working with trauma. So rather than what I observed was within the group process, initially it was about, you know, particularly for the frontline staff and indeed even the middle managers who are often stuck in that very tricky position of having to sort of filter a lot of stuff from the top and from the frontline. You know, just having the capacity You know, how do we build our own resilience and our capacity? Because trauma and behaviors that are, you know, promoted by the traumatic experience are inherent. So we're not going to change that. So how do we build our capacity, increase our tolerance for working with uncertainty, develop a greater appreciation for diversity in approaches and practice, and an open-mindedness to difference? You know, this is relational, so therefore your colleagues are going to have a slightly different approach. Policies are there to be interpreted, they're not there to be fixed. Enhanced resilience in terms of dynamically and emotionally demanding working environments. You know, sometimes the pressures are from within your own team. You may not like the people that you work with. You might be stuck in a service environment where you're doing, you know, long shifts under severe pressure, and you don't get on with your colleagues. How do you work with that? You know, so that additional kind of reciprocity of mentoring and coaching between colleagues to recognize and sort of speak out to some degree the unspeakable. Because I think one of the things about being within the caring environment is that, you know, people feel uncomfortable saying, I'm not living this, or I'm not enjoying this. You know, it's like somehow I've failed. So being able to say, you know, I really want to do my best, and I'm also finding this challenging, which elevated that kind of sense of professional awareness and ultimately role satisfaction, which is good for recruitment and retention. Next slide, Peter. Thank you. And then in terms of the kind of leadership theme that's been running through the book and the invitation to write the chapter, you know, what I noticed over the years of developing the programme, you know, the group members were able to take up their own leadership stance within the reflective practice group. You know, the greatest compliment was when people stopped noticing when I was there. You know, the group would start without me, you know, and then people would apologise and say, oh, we've started already. It's like, of course you have. You know, the process started when the process started. And the organisational wide participation and the prioritisation of reflective practice was really noticeable in how the pro-inquiry learning culture just kind of filtered through. It wasn't to say, it was, I suppose, about that tolerance of the not knowing. It doesn't mean we don't know what we're doing. It means we know what we're doing in an environment that is often surprising and unpredictable. So we don't know. There's always going to be elements we don't know. The permission not to know being a foundation of continuous professional growth, rather than it being a failure or something that has to be fixed. And I really enjoyed the person who mentioned the Housing First model earlier on, because I worked at length with 3 or 4 of those teams, and that was really a trajectory of the kind of not knowing, being okay with it, the trying it out, you know, modifying it, changing it to adapt to the environment that we were in, rather than, you know, taking it off the book as being a model of best practice. And that's really empowering. The recognition then of that relational dynamic being at the heart of social care, and that of course you're going to be full of other people's stuff sometimes, and that's absolutely natural, no matter what, as somebody else mentioned, which is great, whether you're in the accounts department, you're in the acquisitions department, you're all part of this system, and you're going to fill up with other people's stuff. And that greater attention then to the relational dynamics within the organisation, you know, that the systems thinking really promotes that idea, not that it's the frontline service providers that are dealing with the problem and we're all dealing with something else. It's actually, no, this is a system that is dealing with challenge, it's dealing with wonderful recovery outcomes, and sometimes things that we're not so happy about, and that's within the organisation, and that it belongs to the organisation. And therefore that the external relationships particularly with the client groups, but with the partners and the stakeholders, which I think is really important when you're working in advocacy, or you're holding people account from a funding perspective, or you're actually saying, you know what, that tender is priced in a way that is actually going to do damage to the quality of the service. They benefited from that added layer of relational, psychologically and trauma-informed perspectives. You know, there is a line that we will not go below. There is a point at which we're not offering a service, you're asking us to do something else, and having the confidence through a psychologically informed environment to be able to let that be a ruling kind of principle for your organisation. Thanks, Peter. Next slide. It's just in conclusion. So really, I suppose, you know, my observation in the chapter really was acknowledging the breadth and depth of the lived experience in professional settings of seeding that relational awareness that PIE and trauma-informed care does, and creating that consistent opportunity to work with and through the relational dynamics is key really to embedding that practice. Because people who may feel, oh well, there's a crisis, there's an incident, as opposed to, no, this is the ebb and flow. this is the ebb and flow, and there'll be highs and there'll be lows, and it's the consistency around that. And that ultimately that feeds a kind of distributed leadership in the relational approach, because it allows people to recognize that while there might be the requirement for hierarchical leadership in terms of, you know, formalities of signing off on things and various other things, that ultimately within the day-to-day work of the service, that you can distribute your leadership, which is psychologically and trauma informed, in relation to how you're responding to what's required in the here and now. And that self-authorization in role can build a very strong relational base in which inquiry and learning and action are encouraged. And that is, in summary, what my chapter was about.
Sure. Thank you, Ali. Yep, working through it. There's so much in this. And various people have mentioned the difficulty of working in some of the systems and indeed in the difficulty of the work. And so we included a chapter on traumatized organizations and working with trauma within organizations, which Joe Prestige very kindly wrote for us. So Joe, you're up next.
Yeah. Hi everyone. It's been great to be here, great webinar. So yeah, my chapter is about how organizational dynamics and organizations themselves can become traumatized and then traumatizing as a result of that. And so my role is the head of practice development at Homelessly. And so I've been supporting organisations across England for around 10 years to think about how they can become PIE and trauma informed. And I was really interested in what the kind of explicit and implicit barriers of that are. How do you shift a system? And so I went on to study more around organisational dynamics and get some qualifications in that. And so my chapter really draws on a lot of the theory and concepts from that learning and brings a lot of different schools of thought together to think about this topic. So yeah, you can move on, Peter. So it's really shifting the lens from thinking about trauma in relation to individuals and interpersonal into the group dynamics and the system dynamics, and thinking about the types of things that organisations, and you know, organisations aren't static, concrete things, they're groups of people that work together around a shared task. So thinking about how those systems can be impacted by the trauma of going through change or losing a leader, the trauma of working with vulnerable populations who are experiencing their own trauma, and the trauma of the really difficult context that a lot of health and social care organisations working, and then thinking about how, if that emotion that those individuals and groups are experiencing isn't processed, it can manifest in trauma in the way that the system operates, and that unconsciously shapes then how the organisation functions, how it delivers its services, and the overall culture of the organisation. You can move on, thank you. And a lot of you will have heard of, well, I think we all use the term kind of defensive, and we talk about people being avoidant and denying and splitting and projection. And one of the theories that I focus on is social defences against adverse emotion. So how groups of people experiencing in kind of intolerable, difficult emotions as a result of their work and the context they're in can act and manifest some of these defences collectively as well. And I drew on a Brené Brown quote to kind of pull that together, thinking about this armour that we individually and collectively put on to cope with our work. Thank you, Peter. And so, yeah, my chapter kind of concludes in thinking about what a relational leader would do about this, and some of the structures that need to be put in, some of the attributes that can be role modelled, and really thinking about kind of self-awareness and self-care as a leader, making space for the difficult stuff, and really thinking about how change is managed. And other speakers have talked about that as well. So I will leave it there and let the next person speak.
Thank you so much for that amazing brevity, because it's actually a really dense chapter and there's an awful lot in it. And I love that, making space for reality and talking about the difficult stuff. Yeah, so I think The next chapter is actually Helen, and Helen Miles unfortunately can't be with us. I think because I'm doing this completely off my own bat and haven't checked it out with Sione, so she may slap me down. But we might just zoom through the slides of Helen's and move on to Claire's and gain ourselves. But read the chapter, yeah. So that's the best thing to do with Helen's. Sorry she's not here to talk about it herself, but we may just move on now to Claire, so that we have a little bit of time. There's Homeless Licks plug for Joe. Yeah. So I will move on from that. Whoa. And we'll move on to Claire next.
My name is Claire, and I am an independent trainer and consultant, and I see PIE possibly slightly different to how other people do, or maybe just a bit more expanded. I see it as a framework for implementing a trauma-informed approach and strengths-based practice. So that's how I tend to talk about it. I think they're all interlinked and all support each other. And in terms of the chapter in leadership, I'd just like to go back to what Helen was saying right at the beginning about how becoming psychologically informed is all about culture change. And I couldn't agree more. And I think what's been recognised more and more, particularly in Scotland, who've been doing this work for a long time, is that the leaders of the cultural architects are leaders. So it's leaders and managers' role to change the culture of an organisation. Next slide, please. What I'm going to do is take you very quickly through my work with Bournemouth, Christchurch and Poole housing options. It's been a long journey. I think we've been working together since about 2017-18. And it was the manager of the housing directorate who said that they had his division had a lot of things going on. They had the changes in the law. There was going to be a merger. It was actually Bournemouth. I know it was Poole, sorry, that I worked with at first. They were going to be merging with 2 other local authorities. And they have the normal challenges that any housing options division has. Recruitment challenges, overwork, not enough resources. And Ben Tomlin, I don't know whether he's here, but Becky, who's here, will know that what they wanted to make sure that when they came together as one authority, that it was the opportunity for culture change. Next slide, please. Through working with Bournemouth, Christchurch and Poole, these are the outcomes that have been achieved, and it's taken time. And what I realised early on was just delivering training to frontline staff was not enough, because behaviour and practice wasn't changing. We had to involve the managers and the leaders in understanding the work that was understanding trauma-informed practice and psychologically informed practice. So by giving them the training as well, I think the DLUC review in 2022 says it all really, that the independent review noticed in the way that the staff were speaking that the strengths-based approach was evident. So we used the PIE framework to give training on trauma-informed practice and strengths-based practice, and then that became evident, I believe, because the managers started taking a strengths-based approach with the staff. So those are the outcomes. Very quickly, I've got a couple of minutes left. Next slide, please. How did we get there? Devised a training programme that I've been delivering every year. The left-hand side is for the staff and the right-hand side is for the managers. And I think the important bit for the managers is developing a performance framework, a bespoke framework. So that's thinking about the paperwork that they use. In fact, if you go on to the next slide, please, Peter. So this is, I don't actually include the detail of this in the chapter. But fundamentally, it's about staff becoming aware of their own strengths, managers becoming aware of their own strengths and their staff strengths, and then using that knowledge in the performance and development framework. So when they're talking, when they're doing their appraisals, their one-to-ones, they're making sure that they're aligning strengths to their objectives, they're valuing their strengths, they're giving them opportunity to find a way of growing. Yeah, the tools are given to actually have different conversations, all the things that have been spoken about already in touch in other chapters, reflective practice, using different language, working as a team to change the culture of the organisation. And the final slide, please, is a quote from Scotland, actually. Early on, we thought that staff alone, in the on the front, customer facing staff at the grassroots level, going to be able to change and implement psychologically informed environments. They've done a brilliant job, but to really embed it and make it happen and see the changes that we've been talking about today, leaders have to implement it. That's me. I think I went a couple of seconds over.
I think you were brilliantly concise, Claire. It's not something I really associate with you, but it's fantastic. It's so much, isn't it? Leadership is crucial. I think that's a key point. And now, last but not least, Victoria, who's well, she can introduce herself. So
yeah.
What's the next chapter? Whoa.
Hello, I'm Victoria Asfatham. I know it's a bit bright. I'm a rough sleeping accommodation coordinator at Westminster City Council, and also doing some project management with the Changing Future strand there. And I suppose my key thing is that this PIEs and collaboration and commissioning is really all about relationships. And I feel a bit of a fraud because I've been at Westminster for 20 years. So, of course, I've just had much longer to sort of grow relationships, to do the work. And I hope I've, next slide, done some good work in terms of PIE, link up with universities and bringing some funding streams together. So I do think it's the length of time that's been a help. But if I'd been here and been grumpy and waiting for the people over there to change, then probably I wouldn't have got very far. Okay, next slide. Because of course the case for collaboration, it's like stronger than ever, but it's hard with siloed and fragmented, stretched services and a traditional organisation-centric practice. But of course, those barriers will persist unless we purposefully try and create the underlying conditions for people to collaborate. And really, my chapter is about my journey. And for today, I've got 10 top tips of what I've learned along the way that have stood me in good stead in the good times, the harder times. Next slide. So my first thing is, whenever I speak about commissioning, I always raise awareness of this body of work and commissioning complexity. For me, it's a guiding light. It can feel like an antidote to a traditional culture of commissioning that can feel like a very technical space defined by jargon and bureaucracy and markets and metrics. And this is a focus on being human and learning and nurturing the health of the system and the importance of relationships at all levels. And if you like the sound of that, the Collaborate community are growing and they've got really good communities of practice. Next slide. So that's my guiding light. But for top ops of wisdom, I think this Dr. Helen Bevan, who she's on all the social media platforms, but I just think she's just brilliant in terms of speaking about big scale systems change. And she really emphasizes relationships. They're making the biggest difference when it comes to our ability to deliver change and improvement. Next slide. I know on the commissioning side, not staying in my lane, but taking an interest and building relationships with all the adjacent commissioners, drugs and alcohol, health and domestic abuse, has opened up so many opportunities. And often it's a case of being in the right place at the right time, maybe to do a quick turnaround bid. There's an underspend opportunity, influencer specification. But I know there can be a fear factor with moving out of your lane. But the lovely thing, the message in Commissioning for Complexity is you don't have to be an expert. You don't have to be an expert in all these things. You don't have to be an expert to book a big room, to bring people together, to think about, oh, maybe the information governance or writing a funding thing that explains, well, who pays who, and get a terms of reference together. And so that sideways relationships and being the can-do person and the person people come to with queries and who's got a pocket full of ideas has stood us in really good stead. Next slide. But how do you be a person with a pocket of ideas? And I think that's being ready, making time and space for creativity and connection. And I know that stood us in good stead, bringing together different valleys of knowledge, for example, around violence against women and girls, and going on a journey together. But that can be daunting because I think sometimes there's like, what if I book a big room and it's a moan fest and everyone's just stating the problems? So next slide, my top tip is really just investing in your facilitation and sort of systems change skills and creating that kind of environment to have those safe, honest conversations with that psychological safety. I love the World Cafe approach for that. And it's literally stood me in such good stead so many times. And then I got so much out of this, the NHS School for Change Agents. So it's free, it's online, self-paced course. It's for any health and social care staff at any level to build the confidence, knowledge and skills to unleash your inner change agent. That's how they brand it. And I just thought it was brilliant. So next one, putting lived experience at the voice and having someone tap their ability to see the gaps, see the wood for the trees, hone down on what really matters. And of course, they emphasise holistic services, the skilled workers. It just keeps me focused on what really matters. And I've really been grateful to Expert Link, who've helped us get groups off the ground. And they've got a great model for getting groups together that sort of gel and stay together as well. Next one, just taking that bird's eye view, going upstream, looking at the underlying issues. That's what our people with lived experience tell us to do again and again. Yeah. Right. Number 8, about knowing your procurement rules. So my top tip in the commissioning side is really knowing them, to know where the flex is really, to do things differently. And for example, when a waiver's allowed, or the brackets of the low level funding that only need one quote. And the majority of our innovations started off with an under 10 grand, a test and learn pilot. And I thoroughly recommend small pilots because they can kind of take the pressure off. So number 9, about forming a coalition of the willing, and this term positive deviance. Often when tackling problems, it pays to start with what works, and positive deviants are those people with the exceptional behaviours of practices that enable us to get better results than their sort of neighbours who we've got the same resources. But identifying them, creating visibility, sharing it with the rest of the group, and this lovely term, Trojan mice. Lots of people trying things out, failing but learning and sharing it. And final top tip: just starting small. Just often the large scale change is the outcome of lots of smaller cycles of mutually reinforcing changes in multiple systems and processes, and getting more and more people on board who can see, well, there's a way of doing things differently, a future better than the status quo. And always holding on board, the NHS grew from a pilot in a small Welsh mining village of people paying in 2p a week. So from acorns, oaks can grow. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you so very much, Victoria. That was brilliant. That was one of the things. I think Trojan mice is just a total concept that I'm going to have to get my head around. I love that, Trojan mice. And culture change. Lots of people have talked about culture change, and from Helen onwards, it's a theme of culture change, and multiple small changes. Lots of mice. One of the great things about mice is they tend to come in lots. You don't get a mouse, you get lots of mice. Lots of small changes. And now we're going to go to the last chapter, which I think means, Sione, we've got 1 minute. Sione, can you talk faster than I can? You want to go through this? These are the chapters. leaders on, I'll just start off, this is leaders based on their practical experience. So the book's got a huge range of stuff in it. Sione.
Yeah, leadership in PIE and TIC. And so we came up in our concluding chapter, we really focused on recommendations for leaders and organisations. And these are those. So managing relationships, client involvement, reflective practice, crucially at all levels and in all directions, which I think has echoed many people's words this evening. Having a psychological framework, get one, attachment being core in that psychological framework, and crucially leader attitude being client-centered, learning, genuine. And Peter, the last bit there, I'll hand over to you.
And Ubuntu, yes, which has been mentioned already by somebody, which is fantastic. The I am because we are, the African concept that breaks down this this division between the individual and the group as kind of two opposing forces. But actually, the group is made up of individuals, and the individual is a part of a group. We are I am because we are. I think it's just a really neat way of saying it. They're indivisible, the group and the individual.
Because experience suggests that using the key areas of PIE's guiding principles for leadership and development enables leaders to think of and work with the psychological impact of their decisions and of the experiences of their staff and clients. So this enables staff and clients to grow and develop, which in turn enables effective recovery orientated practice in both health and social care.
And the final slide.
When it comes down to it, relationships drive change for us all. So they are central to successful and sustainable change in health and social care services, as they are in life, which is where we started. Thank you so much, everybody.
Let's stop sharing. Yes, thank you so much, everybody. Thank you for sitting through 80-something slides, which is pretty amazing. And I hope you found it really interesting. It reminded me just how interesting the book is. I thought that, but I would, I suppose. We did say we were going to finish at 7:30.
Well, actually, Peter, it's 7:45.
Is it? Oh, fantastic!
Yes. So we do actually have 15 minutes for questions. Just before we attend to any questions, I have put the link to the book in the chat. If anyone's interested, the Rutledge link, you can get it from Amazon too. And actually, I think it's a bit cheaper there. So, so yeah, if you want that to do that, the link is there. I think we had a question for Felicity that I think, Joe, you've already answered really well. Did you want to add anything, Felicity or Joe, to that question? So I can't see where you are, Felicity. Well, you may have gone. Felicity was asking, was there a particular recognised training registration for becoming a PIE?
Yeah, I think Robin answered it really well, actually. That this
it was Robin, sorry. I thought it was Joe. Thank you. Thanks, Joe.
I don't know if Robin's still... Yeah, Robin's there. I don't know if he wants to speak.
Are you there, Robin? There you are.
Yes, I am. But no, thanks, Joe, for mentioning the PIE link. It is really incredible. Well, it's a mess, to be honest. It's such a rag bag of stuff collected over the years, but it is a gold mine for ideas, examples, past papers, conversations, and so on. Just to say, the idea of an accreditation for PIEs was something that was raised a while ago, but I think it's actually a very bad idea, because becoming a PIE is always a kind of personal best for services. There is no point that you have to reach. It's always, as Ray Middleton used to say, it's always a journey, and everybody is on that journey. So that's simply the point I was making there. Sorry, my voice is very croaky, as you may gather, because I'm recovering from a bit of cold and flu.
question from Yetunde. What are your thoughts that PIE and TIC are likely to fail if their elements of lacking resources, short staff, funding, etc. is missing? It's well, various people could answer that. I'll give my first thoughts is it doesn't take an enormous amount of resources, and it's about how you think and approach a problem. Somebody said the problem is the problem, not the person is the problem, and not the person is the problem. And I think that's the thing, is the thinking about it. Somebody once said that the basic element of a PIE is that you think before you do things, and you think together about what you're doing. And it's a very sort of simple start, but that is not expensive. A little bit of time, giving time to things, is also not an expensive resource. There have been many examples of PIEs who are short of staff, and everybody is shorter of funding than they would like. I think funding is always stretched. Do other people want to come in and comment on that?
Yeah, I'd say as having sort of been part of trying to sort of develop and introduce PIE across an organisation for around about almost 10 years, I guess, coming up. I've really noticed that the ebb and the flow, you have to let it go. You have to sort of work with what you've got. You get these bubbles of people that are very interested and sort of creating change, and then people move on their jobs, and then it all sort of breaks apart and then reforms, and that's part of the process. You can't stick with rigidity. You can't stick with this sort of the idea of what it should be, because everything changes, landscapes change, communities change, people move on. But yeah, I think that maybe, I don't know if it could ever fail, but it just maybe might move a little bit slower sometimes.
Can I just add to your point about the thinking? If it's about thinking and thinking together, I would say that reflective practice is a great place to start, and you can do that. That's just the time resource. So I'd say that's a really good place to start if you're lacking resources or money for training, things like that. Start talking and thinking together.
As Ellen raised the question of, if you come up against a senior leader who is simply uninterested in their part in culture change, which I would take a guess that most of us have actually come up against a senior leader who is totally uninterested in their part in culture change. And yes, it is demoralizing, and it's very difficult for the organization. It's often what creates conflict, as you have in many organizations who I won't name, for example, in homelessness, say, the slogan is they're going to end homelessness, and the managers, the leaders go around talking as if they're going to end homelessness. It's nonsense. Of course they're not. And that divorce between reality, and as somebody mentioned, the importance of reality, I think having leaders who will take on reality, and that's probably where you would tackle a leader, is thinking about the reality of the situation. What are they trying to achieve? And the purpose of a leader of an organization, of a chief executive, is to enable the organization to achieve its primary task, its mission, whatever the mission is. And being a psychologically informed environment and a psychologically informed leader, there's huge amounts of evidence of the importance of empathic, compassionate leadership, leading from behind, and enabling leadership. There's lots of different names for it, servant leadership. There's lots and lots and lots about how that creates more effective organizations. So I would go about that saying that they will achieve what they will need to achieve. They're more likely to if they become. I think, Jean, you could probably answer this as well. Sorry to put you on the spot, but
yeah, so yeah, I was reading Ellen's and thinking it's actually, I think it's something that because we've kind of been sort of committed to continually becoming psychologically informed environments since kind of 2011, it's because there's a lot of next new thing sort of approaches, isn't there? And sort of sometimes, you know, particularly if you're looking at our sector and it's subject to commissioning, and commissioning kind of follows maybe next new thing approaches or whatever. It's a challenge really to sort of weave that next new thing into that wider context of being a psychologically informed environment. And at first it was, for a while, it was all about ACEs, and it was almost like they were instead of. Then it was about trauma-informed care, and it was almost like that was instead of, as opposed to kind of what Claire and what others have been talking about here, strengths-based approaches. It's all part of that weave, isn't it? I mean, I love that horizontalism. You know, we talk about that kind of, you know, that horizontal weave rather than the vertical silos that you often get, you know. And when resources are really tight, it's almost like the vertical silos become more, because everybody hangs on. I'll have a bit of yours, but what's mine's my own sort of approach. And when actually it's the time when you need more of the vertical weave. I don't think there is one simple thing, because power and pips on shoulders often mean that listening can be quite difficult. And if you have got a really psychologically informed environment, and that's how your colleagues and your organization is being brought through, then I would trust that they would certainly be able to have that informed discussion with that leader that has come in and is not interested. And that would be part of the kind of, you know, somebody talked about, you know, sort of dispersed leadership report, that would be, you would see leadership throughout the organization and be able to have those discussions. But it is hard, and it's hard when the leaders just want to tick boxes in relation to commissioning boxes and become, you know, showing that you've done a bit of PIE actually can sometimes tick those boxes, and that's not what you get. In fact, you often get staff that are even more teed off, because they will go on the course and then they come back and they recognize in the organization that that's not how they're treated. That's not, you know, it's like what Joe talked about, traumatized organization creates trauma, and they're even more teed off, being polite there, but you know what I mean, than there would be if they'd never been on the, if not been on the course. So again, I think, yeah, you're right, good, start reading the book. And then having those conversations with other leaders that have kind of, you know, sort of being committed, and why, and what does it achieve, and what are the outcomes.
Yeah, thank you. Ali, you wanted to say something there?
Oh, thanks, Peter. Sorry, I wasn't sure whether you could see my hand. Yeah, no, it was just to I suppose to echo that really in terms of the sort of internalization of psychologically informed practice. Ironically, even though we are you know, working into a commissioning environment, and you know, resources are really tight, and all of those realities are very, very real. And you know, not, you know, lots of institutions not even surviving, and services, you know, I'm not in any way Pollyanna about the reality of that, but actually I think that's why it's so critical to have that internal resilience, because there is that piece that particularly comes whenever you get into the stakeholder and the third party engagement piece of like, oh, you know, are you doing that? Are you doing trauma informed care? Are you doing PIE? And my experience of PIE, and I worked with Peter on this, you know, was through the sort of ascendancy of trauma-informed care, and people stopped being able to use the idea of PIE because they were like, oh, isn't it trauma-informed care now? And I've forgotten the name of the lady who was talking about the framework. I think it was the last speaker. And so that's how I used to reference it, was like, you know, PIE is the framework, PIE is the mothership, and trauma-informed care and any other kind of model that you choose to work with that is more granular in its, you know, in its application sits within that. But PIE is your resilience bubble. This is about keeping the system and the organization safe and healthy and able to metabolize what's going on behalf of, you know, the system, the wider community system that it's working in, which includes clients and people who need your support. So, I mean, I totally agree with you, but the big piece for me in terms of PIE is sustained longevity, commitment, keeping at it. And therefore, what I've started to think about it as is it's an internal value system for an organization. You know, it's your divining rod, and, you know, in a way, I stopped trying to convince people that it was a good idea or a bad idea, and just kind of went, you know, you're either living it or you're not, and you know it in terms of your job satisfaction, you'll know it in terms of your relationship with your colleagues, you'll know it in terms of the results with your clients, or not, as the case might be, but it doesn't give you the capacity to think about what's going on in a different way.
Thank you very much, Ali. You've got lots of fans on the PIE as the mothership, and I think that's probably going to bring us to a close, that idea that PIE is the mothership. Thank you all so much thank you for all the authors, for, as well as writing the chapters, for having presented this evening. Thank you very much for everybody who's listening, participating, and putting in interesting questions. Do feel free to contact us if you want to discuss it more or find more resources, and we can put you in touch with people and so on. But thank you all. And do you want to say anything else, Sione? Or...
No, just a big thank you to everybody. And I'm just going to stop recording in a second. So thank you so much for coming. It's been brilliant. Thank you. Okay.
Okay. Goodbye all.
Bye-bye.